meditation, especially if you're doing it sort of in a retreat or something for day after day, getting the simple things down so that you kind of keep an even pace is sometimes challenging, and it's on the simple things: food, clothes, and sleep. So if you have too many clothes on and you're too hot, you'll fall asleep. If you don't have enough, then you'll chill out and you'll be uncomfortable the other way. If you eat too much or too little, it's the same thing. It's an imbalance. And then sleeping, again, simple things, but getting that down so it's, are we adjusting the sound? Yeah. Okay. Anyhow, not even during a retreat, just normally getting these things down can be tricky. How many clothes are enough? How much sleep is enough? How much food is enough? What kind of food is enough? Yeah. My teacher once said, these are the very, very simple things, but most of our lives we struggle with them and never really nail them down. I'm just doing one adjustment here, if you'll be patient with me. Okay. We're on chapter 10, continuing. And tonight, I'm just going to do the last verse. Which would be bottom of 9. So the Chinese is 能缘所缘力种种法出生宿灭不常停念念悉如是. So we're finishing up this section of verses where Bodhisattva of great wisdom, Manjushri Bodhisattva, is asking, where the leader Bodhisattva in this assembly, some questions having to do with why sages, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas bother to continually teach and transform living beings who are difficult to teach and transform, very confused, sometimes obstinate and stubborn, but having no fixed nature. And that's where the verse starts, is that from the perspective of whether they're real or not, the verse says they aren't. Living beings are temporary phenomena, which includes us. And now that got into the theme last week about what happens when the passing, the coming and going of birth and death, particularly dealing with death. And I was going to share some more on that this week. A Buddhist view of death and dying. And this last verse is describing the condition that most living beings find themselves in. It says, the force of conditions and that which pursues them brings myriad phenomena into being. Ephemeral, they soon vanish without pausing for an instant. This continues in thought after thought. So, what this is describing is the continuous momentum of people and then of all living beings on this notion of samsara. And the notion of samsara is that birth is not a beginning and death is not an end, but there's a going on, and literally that's what samsara means, going on. And so you see this in thought after thought here in this last passage here where it says, without pausing for an instant, it continues in thought after thought, but it also continues as the thoughts continue into life after life. So there's a continuity, and the continuity is driven by conditions generated by the mental states and random thoughts that we produce and then pursue and then follow. And in a sense, this idea, thought after thought, life, it's kind of a Buddhist version of Groundhog Day, everybody? Know what Groundhog Day is? It's sort of this endless repetition of tedious things that seems to never end. So this is not a bad current metaphor for the idea of samsara. In samsara, though, the going on, and it gets a little more complicated, it's not you caught in Groundhog Day, you know, you again, you again, you again, as you are presently constructed. But you can go through various paths of return existence. And these are called the 10 realms or the 10 Dharma realms. And the one that's significant here is the 6 realms, from hells, animals, ghosts, people, asuras, and gods. These are the 6 common or the 6 returning realms for the unawakened. So it's not the case that you come back as Charlie or Mary or whoever, Zhang Er or Wang Ying or whoever each time, but you may come back in a different body based on your karma. So this gets a little more complicated than just Groundhog Day, which I don't know if I've really seen, I've heard about it. So isn't it the case where the guy keeps coming back and repeating? So it's this one guy keeps coming back, right? He doesn't come back as a groundhog. Okay. Well, that would be more the possibility, or the groundhog and him change places. Then you're getting a better idea of what samsara might be. Sorry, I'm digressing here. So these thoughts, these random thoughts and mistaken thoughts are really called, this misseen, turns into what's called samskara. And samskara is one of the 5 skandhas, and it refers to, in the 5 skandhas, it's broken, 5 skandhas are the 5 heaps of formations, and it's talking about, from a Buddhist, again, or awakened point of view, what we think of as me is a combination of mind and body. Nama rupa, it's called. Rupa is the form, that's the first one, that's the physical body. The other 4 are mind, feelings, cognitions, and then samskara, which is formations, and finally consciousness. Those 4 make up the mind. And the samskara is really the generating, continuing generating function of the mind. And it can literally be translated as formations. In other words, either the deep habitual patterns that we're kind of set up and locked into, almost the unconscious. But it's also very active and dynamic. It's what we're forming, what we're crystallizing by our repetitive actions, by these thoughts and things we pursue. So it's sort of like we're formed. We come in with a sort of paradigm, so to speak, or patterned, and at the same time, we're creating those. So there's a very busy, that's what they call the mad mind, constantly fabricating, constructing these things. So this gets into this idea, when it says thought after thought continues, this has to do, and the first line of this mentions the force of conditions. So this goes into this really key concept called conditioned arising. that everything that happens comes from previous causes and conditions. It's in Sanskrit, it's pratitya samyutpada. And this gets represented as this process of continuation. And so it's not just vague and say thought after thought it continues. The texts actually go into a really interesting psychology and map out 12 links that go in succession that then cause the continuation, the continued co-arising. It's almost like the habitual pattern. It's the broken down. And the first one, I just throw it out. Who knows what the first one is? It gives me a chance to sip my tea while you're Googling or thinking. Don't Google, just see if you, yeah, I know somebody in the back Googling. Don't Google, okay? What's the first link? What's that? Oh, really quiet. One of my teachers used to say, if you're going to make a mistake, make it loud. Anybody remember? I know we go over this and it kind of goes in, goes out. Yeah, we're in the, who said that? Someone online. Yeah, so I don't know where they got that. Maybe they remembered, maybe they didn't. It's literally in Sanskrit avidya. And vidya is like video, right? Video, to see. So avidya in Sanskrit means not seen. And this is a very interesting idea. This has to do with what it means to be not awake. So you're not seeing clearly. It doesn't mean you're blind, literally, but you are spiritually and cognitively blind in a sense. And so avidya means not seeing things clearly. That is the fundamental root, then, of the chain. After there's not seeing, we get spooked. We're not seeing things clearly, and we react to things not as they really are, but as we imagine them to be, either because we fear they're that way or we want them to be that way. So fear and fondness are the two sides that pro this thing forward, and that becomes the second one, samskara or karma. So the ignorance leads to actions, activities, and that's where it says these random thoughts and state. And then what comes next? The third link. I won't go through the 12 tonight because I know it's too tedious. Oh, you looked it up or you remember? Which one? Huh? Oh, no. This is called vijnana. So you have avidya, samskara, vijnana. What's vijnana? This is the Buddhist SAT. BSAT, Bodhisattva. Anybody?
Consciousness?
How's that?
Consciousness?
Right, but it's a particular kind of consciousness. Jhana, the word jhana means knowledge, but it means spiritual knowledge, like almost like prajna. Jhana is something close to the unitary consciousness that sees everything. It's sometimes like a bright, perfect mirror, and everything is perfectly reflected in it. It's a metaphor for your mind that is able to encompass and think things really clearly, not filtered, not discriminated, not in any way tarnished. So your mirror is perfectly bright, and this is jhana. Vijnana is actually divided consciousness. So you have the unitary consciousness, but then what happens, it collapses and fragments this unitary consciousness. And then all the stuff starts. The other 9 links spin off of that, because once you're down that road, it's just one error after another. However, each produces another effect, leading to aging, sickness, and death. So this is how the 12 links go. It begins with ignorance, conditions, activities, which considers consciousness and goes on, and then becomes becoming and a new life. And so this is describing that cyclical process. And it's something some people say happens in moment to moment. A thought, an activity arises, it goes through these things and it's over with. It's that fast. And other people say it happens over lifetimes. However you break it down, it's describing, and it's, even if I were good at this kind of stuff, and I'm not, philosophically, if I could really explain it clearly, the Buddha himself says good luck. Because it is a vision. No, that's not the right. It was an insight he had into the nature reality upon his awakening. When he awakened, under the Bodhi tree, supposedly that's where he was sitting, and he said, I'm not going to get up until I figure this out. It was like a puzzle. What is the meaning of this life that only begins and ends in a like that, and there's a brief interval in between? Where does this come from? Where does it go? This is the kind of question he was asking. And when he had that insight, he had insight into dependent origination, the 12 links. He saw it. He didn't think it up. He didn't take it as a textual explanation, but it's something he saw directly. So this is really interesting. In this model, things don't just happen. Now, things happen, but they don't just happen. You get this difference here. Things happen under certain conditions. And what it's describing is this conditionality. It's a principle of causal regularity, that there is something almost like a law of physics operating in what we think, what we do intentionally, and what we say with our 3 karmas, that then sets in motion energy waves, if you wish to use that then return as consequences or effects. And those in turn, we respond to again and again and again. So if that causal regularity is like a basic pattern or dharma, if you want, the basic pattern of things, it can be discovered, and this is the key. Not only does it not just happen, but it doesn't happen, how shall I say, without causality, just by chance or circumstance or, what's the other word, capriciousness or spontaneity. But there is a regularity to these things. And these can be discovered. So this is the key. Because it just made, well, why is this happening to me? Why am I this way? Why is so-and-so that way? Why is this disaster, tragedy falling on someone and not somebody else, and so forth? Why am I rich or poor? Remember earlier in the text it says rich and poor, ugly, beautiful, healthy, unhealthy. Why are all these differences if living beings are basically the same? And it goes on, it says karma. Karma's the explanation. Now, got to be careful here because karma this way is being used as descriptive and not judgmental. Very, very carefully. It's not used in a way, that's your karma, It's used in a descriptive way, almost a way a doctor, a good doctor, would use diagnostics, do some scans, do some blood work and say, you're okay, or no, you're not okay. You picked up a sexually transmitted disease. Shame on you. You're going to hell. No, the doctor doesn't do that, right? Or you got cancer. Too bad. I'm sorry. It's your karma. What the doctor does is simply describe what that situation is, and then, if possible, come up with some remedial intervention, right? So in this text, you have to avoid this idea of a kind of, I've heard this used somehow that generally in a negative way, you got what's coming to you. It's like poetic justice. That's not what this is meant to be at all. It's just meant to be a description of that causal regularity pattern. And because it's a causal regularity pattern that almost has an impersonality to it, there's not a divine agent behind sort of taking stock. You did that. You thought you got away with it. You didn't get away with it. It's on my checklist here. And when the time comes up, I'm going to zap you. This is not that kind of Old Testament version of whatever. The thing about it and why people are cultivating, why these monks and nuns are like sitting in meditation for long periods of time is because they're trying to get at the initial movement of that causal dynamic, which begins with the most subtle of thoughts, most subtle of feelings, and most subtle of emotions moving. A little bit of offness to a little fear, a little anxiety, a little lust, a little anger. And they go down and they finally get to this point where those random thoughts and feelings are becoming obvious to them. This takes a certain quietness because mostly we're distracted to the nth degree, and so we really never listen to ourselves. So what they're doing is not zoning out, but they're tuning in. And when they're tuning into that deep mechanism where this all begins, the first avidya, called the first turning. And when they get to that, they can then reverse engineer their present situation back and back to say, here's the seed, here, and bija is a Sanskrit word, here's the seeding that takes place. And so that you can discover the pattern, and you can understand the pattern. It's rational in a sense. It's not like mystical and miraculous or, how shall I say it, unpredictable. It's very, and then the key thing is you can get some mastery over it, and they use the word transcend. I would use the word more like accomplish, achieve the fullness of this capacity of the mind. So what the text describes here is in saying that mind that moves in that direction is the same mind that moves towards Buddhahood. It's not two different minds. It all depends on the use. So if it's used well, in other words, if you get to that root and you're watching that arisal and then the effects that it has, you're moving towards awakening. Not using it correctly, not paying attention to it, letting it overwhelm, then you're using it unwisely and it turns out the opposite. But it's not like it's two different dynamics between the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and ordinary living beings. That's the key here. So basically, I had a wonderful summary from my teacher. Let me read this. In summarizing these verses, he says, basically what's going on here is living beings have missed what are called here false thoughts and attachments. And you know, this is a famous passage when the Buddha, upon his awakening, says basically, wow, what I just realized, what I just discovered is universal, not only to people, but to all living beings. All living beings have this potential, this capacity. And it's only because of this wrong thinking, false thought, and attachment and grasping that they don't realize it. So Master Hua's thing is that living beings have these thoughts and attachments, and that where there was no trouble to begin with, they create it. And when there's nothing that needs to be done, they look for something to do. They turn their backs on awakening or enlightenment and unite with the dust, which are the afflictions, klesha. Turning one's back on enlightenment is simply lacking wisdom. And uniting with the dust is just being foolish. Out of foolishness, one grasps at, and this is interesting, out of this mistaken foolishness is avidya. It's another translation. Out of this foolish spook, can I use the word spook? Did I use that? It's not, I don't mean like a ghost. I got to go back to my Midwest on the farm when it said the horse is spooked, the cow spooked. And what that meant was they were out there mooing and eating and very happy and whatnot, and then a tree branch broke or fell or something like that, and they freaked out and they started to gallop and run around. They spooked. It was just a tree branch or maybe a turn in the wind. But here it's saying out of this foolishness, one gets spooked and grasp at empty and illusory states of conditioned, impermanent, fleeting phenomena. All people have a vain and unreal attachments that they're unable to break through, and so they mistake the false for the true, and they take suffering as bliss. Born in this world deluded, they can't see anything clearly, and not seeing things clearly, we sink into ever deeper states of confusion. Turning one's back on enlightenment, we unite with the dust. However, if you can turn your back on the dust and reunite with awakening, if you can let go of the muddled thoughts concerning worldly confusion, attachments, you return naturally to the purity of your own nature. But if you can't do that, then your original true and proper wisdom will not come forth. So you see, this is very interesting. It's not like, where's the agency here? The agency isn't the Buddha or Bodhisattva or some divine being. It's like, what are you doing now with your mind and your body and your emotions? It's like, that's what it's all about. If you can look at those and examine those clearly and see and ask, where's this going? What's this about? Is this producing a kind of well-being in me, an ease and a comfort and insight? And is it doing the same for others? And by extension, what is the impact on the natural environment? These three dimensions, your own psychology, the social, and the natural worlds. If you can see this, it's sort of, it begins in the smallest of these places. It begins in these thoughts and emotions that seem like nothing. But everything that's happening in the world, up to the last events of the week and so forth and going on, all begins in this mind. That's the beginning. Now, they don't end with the mind, they radiate out. That's the karmic waves of this. But the actual beginning is in these small movements. So when people are doing this practice, in a sense, they're engaging in an effort for world peace. They're not just withdrawing from reality and solipsistically sort of sitting there thinking about their own well-being, but they're trying to get to where the causal mechanism begins to engage and starts along a path that proliferates and grows. Every sort of genius that gets a Nobel Prize and every serial killer started from the same place, this one thought. And that's why it's said in one of the texts, the 10 realms of existence, the 10 realms don't go beyond a single thought. That's where they begin. Thought after thought this way, thought after thought, it proliferates and grows, thought after thought the other way, it becomes a Buddha. This is really, so in a sense, when people come to a place like this to do meditation, they're really rolling up the sleeves and going to work on the most dynamic of socially engaged practice. Because all your relationships, good or bad, come from these thoughts and feelings and emotions that we are constantly generating. So when the Buddha had this state and saw this, you all know he was reluctant to teach. The story about that, right? Why was he reluctant to teach? Because it didn't pay enough in India at the time. They didn't offer him tenure. Stock benefits. Close. What he was saying was, what it took for me to subdue and regulate my mind and my habits. And he said, I'm telling you, it wasn't just one lifetime. It wasn't like I just started out when I was 27 years old, and by the time I was, 40, got it. He's saying, I've been doing this for a long time, but I never tired of doing it. Once he understood that, he thought, this is just too hard. It's just too hard to people. And so here's what he said. And this is from a Pali text called The Noble Search. And it goes like this. He said, I considered this dharma that I've attained, this truth that I've obtained, is profound, hard to see and hard to understand, peaceful and sublime, but unattainable by mere reasoning. You remember that previous passage when it said worldly reasoning, intellect doesn't reach it? So he said it's unattainable by mere reasoning. It's subtle, has to be experienced. Can be experienced, but can't be explained. Those who experience it are wise. Those who don't experience it are not. It's that simple. So he said it's almost impossible to put into words. But it can be experienced. So his teaching involved using words expediently to bring people to that direct experience, like a catalyst, right? So it wasn't like the teaching was given through words. The words were sort of like water sprinkled on seeds that then caused the seeds to generate on their own capacity that they had. So he said, however, now this is funny because this is, right, supposedly from the time of the Buddha. He says, this generation, I'm not making, he says, this generation delights in attachment. So obviously we're okay because we don't delight in attachment. It was only that generation back then that delights in attachment. Or, by extension, we delight in attachment. Takes delight in attachment, rejoices in attachment. It's hard for such a generation to see this truth. So again, this is why he hesitates to teach. Upon his awakening, there were two things that he considered to be extremely profound and at the heart of what his teaching was. One was this dependent origination concept. He actually saw the mechanism by which A thought that's off leads to actions that leads to the loss of the unitary consciousness that then leads to fragmentation and the grasping and seeking and whatnot that eventually takes us down the path of dust. So this was one. Anybody know what the other was? So here's the thing. One was the description of this mechanism of conditioned arising leading to birth and death and so forth. The other one was the opposite of that, which is presented as nirvana. So both of those, the stopping of this process and the working out and the origination of this process, he said is really, really difficult and hard to comprehend. Not impossible, but very, very difficult. And the reason it's difficult is not that it's intellectually difficult. I mean, you could map this out and probably write a pretty cool essay, a dissertation on it. But the actual visceral swallowing it, making it part of your body, the embodied absorption of this, so that it is available to you 24/7 and you see things clearly all the time and don't even have an inclination to misstep. That process takes a really long time, and it's not as simple as just getting a head around it. It's a behavioral transformation at the deepest level. And that's why it's considered, they call it natural, ziran. And sometimes in the other texts they say wu wei, without doing, without the doing of thought, without the doing of consideration or anything. It's just like that, second nature to you now. It's interesting that in another passage, because I'd like to share these texts with you, because he said we don't understand and don't penetrate, and it's very much what Master Hua was saying, because we turn our backs on that and so forth. And then he uses people become tangled like a ball of string. Any of you ever, well, let's see, you ever go fishing? Don't say you did, because you're not supposed to kill fish, but you know, if you ever went fishing, or you ever see a fish line as it gets all tangled in knots? I'm trying to think of what else has that quality of being tangled in knots. A what? A kite string, okay. Yeah, what else?
Charging cables?
What? Necklaces. Okay. I was remembering my sisters with the knots in their hairs. They get their hair would get all knotted, and they try to get it out and untangle it, and it's really hard to do yourself. And finally, they start cutting it or ripping it and tearing at it. It gets so tangled, it's really hard to unknot. What were you going to say?
Those charging cables or those devices?
What is it?
For your phones and those cables, charging cables?
What are charging? Oh, charging cables. Okay. It doesn't appear in the early Pali, but it's possible. Like a tangled ball of charging tables, or knotted hair, or a fishing line. And he says because of these strong views, diti or drishti, that we have, we just can't free ourselves. This, by the way, is both intellectual, you know, we don't understand things, but it's also, I would say, visceral, almost kinesthetic, soma, with the body. So this feeling, when you're in this, it doesn't mean you're just sort of confused and muddled. It means in your tummy, in your body, there's this tightness, there's a wound upness. There's a knot in the belly, so to speak. The inability, and this manifests as having trouble sleeping, having trouble just relaxing, responding naturally. And if you actually were to, people that work with the body and do body work can actually feel this in the bodies. I just read this really interesting article. Now I'm digressing again, but it's cool because it has to do with horses, horse training. Anybody see this article? This guy that works with horses, and he's so attuned to horses and their bodies, and the horse is so attuned to our body that his method of training, he says, instead of talking to the horse, it's talking, instead of talking at the horse, it's talking to the horse. And it all has to do with listening, but he says the sensitivity of a horse's body is so finely tuned, it puts us to shame. And they pick up on our tension. So he's working with people in therapy who are unwinding these knots by getting into a relationship with a horse. I find this interesting. Yeah, now this is hard to do in Berkeley, I realize. But if you check out this article, it's a really worth article to look at. But it has to do with, and he said himself, he was so knotted up and tight from his childhood trauma and things like that, that he was just plowing through life unaware that he was a ball of knots until this horse started to push against him and resist and whatnot. And he had to relax these knots in order to have a harmony with the horse. And once that happened, he said the horse had actually was my therapist that taught me. So it's really worth reading. But anyhow, when Ananda has this insight, Ananda thinks he understands this, and he says, oh, it's wonderful and marvelous, Venerable Sir, how this dependent arising is so deep and appears so deep, yet to myself it seems so clear as clear can be. Once again, Ananda steps out a little forward, and the Buddha says to Ananda, do not say that, Ananda. Do not say so. The dependent arising is deep and appears deep. Because of not understanding, not penetrating this Dharma, Ananda, this generation has become like a tangled ball of yarn, so to speak, like a knotted ball of thread, like matted rushes and reeds pushed down, and does not pass beyond samsara, the plane of misery, unfortunate destinations, and they end up in the lower realms. And then he says, one who sees dependent origination sees the Dharma. The heart of the Dharma is seeing this dependent origination. And one who sees the Dharma sees dependent origination. This is right from one of the Nikayas called the Greater Discourse of the Simile of an Elephant's Footprint. So he then reverses it and says, when somebody begins the study and practice of this, they have to go back to these first thoughts. And the first thoughts is where the me and the mine are set up, where there is no me or mine, that's a permanent, unchanging entity. But that's constructed psychologically. And that comes about through this mistaken thought of being spooked and then clinging. How is it untangled? It's untangled through study and practice, not just theoretically. And this is, he says, here's how it goes. When someone's cultivating like this, and this identity, these identities start to form and crystallize, the contemplation is, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. So this begins this calming of the mind so that when the attachment starts to form, you simply watch the formation start to take place, and by not feeding it, not by repressing it, not giving into it, it suddenly reveals itself. And then he says, one sees it thus as it actually is with proper wisdom, and one becomes, this is indeed how there comes to be inclusion, gathering, amassing of things into the five aggregates. Not recognizing this, the five aggregates arise. And so he said, basically, you're undoing this. Let me read another part of this commentary here. So last week I read you this text by a Pali monk, a forest monk, and I didn't finish it with you. And he's describing at the point where one approaches death and dying, they don't see it like Aristotle did not see it as an end, but merely a transformation, a powerful transformation, okay? It's not like opening and closing the refrigerator door. This is a powerful transformation. Nonetheless, it's not an end. This is a critical part here. The Buddhist text, so Aristotle was vague about, he thought, believed that the soul went on to another life, but was very inexplicit about it. These texts that I want to share with you today, bringing up, is very explicit about what happens, and I just share with you in that spirit. So this is from a monk called Ajahn Giacundo, or Chundo. Anybody know his time? He's actually relatively contemporary. He passed away in 2004. So some of the texts I've been reading you tonight go back to the time of the Buddha, 2,000 plus years or so. This one, very interestingly, is essentially saying the same thing of these ancient texts, but now replicating it in the 20th to 21st century. And that's what I find really interesting about this. Once you get beyond the schools and the isms and the Dharma, and you get down to the existential human psychological experience of going into this laboratory and working on yourself, it seems as if to me, when I read this, you have what I call intersubjective testability. Replication of these experiences across time, across cultures, across gender, and so forth. It's not limited to the ancient past. And so it's very existentially real, still going on. So I'll cover a little bit of this. You probably forgot from last week, so I'll repeat it. When the average person, now, Giacundo is he's doing these deep meditations. When he does these deep meditations, they talk about getting a lasso on their chitta, on the mind. The mad monkey mind is curbed. How do they do that? They regulate their food, their clothes, their sleep. They get away from distractions. It's an expedient device to get back to the original mind. They don't do it to escape reality, but they do it to penetrate reality, to get to what's real. Very much like Thoreau when he says, I'm going to Walden Pond to get life in a corner and find out what's going on here. So they pull away, have a moment where they have a withdrawal from everything they've been doing, including their identity. So why they change their name, the shaving of the head, the changing of the clothes, are not just symbolic, they're real efforts on the mind-body level to create an identity that isn't constructed by society or even by your ego. So what they're doing is they're bringing it down to the most simple of basic things here, the most simplest facts of existence. And that's where they get into finally doing these deep meditative states, examining and investigating their minds. Not when one monk made a mistake, and he said, when I get to this, I have penetrating insight. I can see things really clearly. I can visit the other realms of existence with the gods and the devas and the spirits. And he said, wow, that was so trippy. I would do it every day, every night. And he said, finally, I realized I was just doing spiritual sightseeing. I wasn't ending my problem. I was just tripping out on this. So there's, none of you are going, well, what? That doesn't happen to me. Yeah, it doesn't happen to maybe yet. But there might come a time when you do start to, I won't say enter, you'll be able to see these realms, because what they're saying is that these aren't realms that are far away. They're actually here and now. These realms are coexisting with us, interpenetrating without obstruction. However, because we're obstructed, we don't see them. We just see me and my world, right? But they don't. They break down and they bring the unitary consciousness back. They bring the fragmented, collapsed consciousness, expand it and open it up again. And when they do, they see things as they really are, including these realms. So Ajahn Mun said he didn't have a good teacher and he wasn't able to read books. So when he started meditating, he started to do this. He did it for a long time, and he said, oh, wait a minute, I'm spiritual sightseeing, I got to stop. So he was basically at the Costco of spiritual states and just filling his cart and coming back. Anyhow, Ajahn Kundo says, when the average person's physical and cognitive functions deteriorate to the point where they can no longer sustain life, the knowing awareness, and that's a word to use, that instilled life into the body and mind at conception and maintained its living presence throughout periods of growth, sickness, aging, and finally death, vacates. This knowing awareness vacates. Now the sixth patriarch says it's like the body is like a hotel room, Motel 6. You go and you spend the night and you leave. Somebody once says, does the body have a soul? And the teacher's answer was, the soul sometimes takes a body. It's not the other way around. The soul borrows a body, but continues. It's not that the body has a soul. So he says, when this vacates, it leaves a lifeless corpse behind. If you've ever been, any of you here have ever been and sat with somebody to go through this stage, And I've done this 5 or 6 times now, more than 5 or 6 times. So for me, this is very real and visceral. When you sit with somebody who's dying, and finally that breath stops, you have a lifeless corpse. And it's powerful. I remember with my little sister there, and all of a sudden she wasn't there anymore. There was just this blob. Getting cold, no chi, no energy at all. And it's like, it was just gone. And it just blew my mind. It blew my mind. It was like, where did she go? Right? She was there and suffering and looking at me, and suddenly nothing. Just as if a light bulb burned out. So it's what he's talking about is very real to me. He says the knowing awareness associated with that person carries with it the effects of all intentional good thoughts, bad thoughts, speech, and actions, karma. That knowing awareness carries with it, committed during that lifetime, as an ongoing legacy for the future. So your inheritance at that point is not gold and silver, material things, it's this legacy of the karma. And at the culmination of one's life, the karmic legacy is duly transferred to the consciousness presence of a living being in the next life. So this is what, in other terms I mentioned last week, it's called the intermediate skandha body. It's this very wispy, seemingly thin, disembodied awareness or consciousness that goes from life to life. And it's a repository, it's the lingering effects of the 8th consciousness, the deepest level of consciousness that then seeds the next body. So sometimes it's said in the text, it's the first to come when there's conception, and it's the last to go when there's the ending. And so I'll continue then. Stated in another way, delusion creates the conditions for karma and its consequences, which themselves determine the circumstances and conditions of the next birth. So here's the continuity. When it continues, it continues. It's not like everything starts over new. It's actually, there's a continuity, and the continuity is the karmic link. That's why working on the karma is like the most important thing to do when you're in a human body, is to work on that mind ground of your karma. Not to get lost in all the other things, because life passes so quickly, but work on that one is well laid. He says, delusion imparts a karmic blueprint that outlines all the qualities and character traits contained in that individual's karmic legacy, which is integrated into the knowing awareness that sustains the life in the body and mind, and then into a developing fetus. At birth, the karmic cycle continues with more actions and their karmic results ad infinitum. Remember, the text says it goes on, samsara. This recurring pattern represents the never-ending cycle of samsaric existence. Now, I'm going on to the new material. This is where we ended last week. This knowing awareness has no personal characteristics. This is really interesting. In this state, this knowing awareness, you don't have a body, you don't feel a body. You don't actually, there's not a thing about temperature. There's no up and down, left or right. No orientation like that at all. There's a knowing awareness, but all these other things that we associate with our life, the feeling, the touching, it's all not there. It doesn't have any personal characteristics. It doesn't even have a name. However, it is not born, nor does it die. This is something I know personally. So death is not the end. That's the big fear people have. Oh, when I die, the light's gone and it's over. It actually isn't. It is timeless, boundless, and radiant, he says. But its true nature is obscured by mental defilements and clouded by delusion. This delusion creates within that awareness a center or focal point of the knower. The existence of that false center produces an individual perspective, which is a nucleus of self-identity. And this self forms a perception of duality, the knower and the known. And from there, awareness flows out to produce physical and mental perceptions of all the sensory experiences, vijnana, divided, fragmented. The feedback from this outflow then reinforces the knower's sense of individuality by creating the false impression that there exists a world of experience separate from the one who knows it. The personal perspective begins with currents of mental activity that flow outward to create an entire sensory world. This is Yogacara. And the world of conditioned phenomena. Therefore, all physical and mental phenomena exist relative to the knower. We don't know things as they are. We know things as we imagine them to be, as we project them to be. We are the filter through which this cognitive field is set up. This is what the meaning is: everything is made from mind alone. And the awareness that perceives these things. As such, they're merely conditioned manifestations that the knower is brought into being and imbued with meaning. Gradually, these manifestations become incorporated into the knower's sense and their identity. Thus, the known becomes enmeshed with the knower, trapping the knower in a web of self-delusion. Back to the Pali text. The knower is reduced, depending on its own manifestations, to provide a sense of continuity to its perceived existence. Therefore, although awareness knows, it knows falsely. And it knows falsely because of the fundamental delusion of a self-being lying at the center of the knower that influences all this experience. That central belief projects a concrete sense of self into the activities of body and mind and the perception of the six fields of senses. Bang. So here, this is fast, and I realize I went through it, but it's okay. I could download this on if you wanted to take a look at this later and read it. But what I stressed last week was, first of all, this wasn't theory. This is something he experienced directly through the practice of his cultivation and was able to articulate it in this way. Very different from the sense of, I die and that's it. What you're getting here is a very detailed breakdown of the mechanism, the operating mechanism that we're working within now and that will continue even after the point that we die. And the whole point of this cultivation is to begin to understand that mechanism, to be able to skillfully work with it and actually take control of our destiny. This is pretty cool. Okay, I won't tell you about why I know this personally. That's another story. But I will share with you another passage of text to describe. Because you see in these, one of the courses we do at the university is we do a course on the lives, the autobiographies and lives of cultivators throughout time. So we look at their lives by their notes, and it's a really interesting sketch. And what's interesting is these patterns recur from the earliest time of the Buddha up to the 21st century and are still happening now. And so it's a very interesting thing. So what I want to go back to is, and often what happens with these, they know in advance when they're going to die. Now, we all know in advance we're going to die, much as we want to deny it. What is one of the French philosophers says, man is the only animal that knows he will die. He's not the only one that knows he's dying. But these individuals know when they're going to die. Okay. I got to find this passage for you. That, oh gosh, come on. So this occurs with the great master Huineng, the sixth patriarch in the Tang dynasty. Tang dynasty, anybody? No, long time ago, 900 so, Common Era. The sixth patriarch was illiterate, and very interesting. So he came to this state of understanding through his direct practice and transformation, not through learning per se. And so as he goes on and he teaches in his life and he has disciples and he has a profound influence on them, and the text that they recorded his talks and wrote them into the text is called the Platform Sutra, or in Chinese, Untangling. And so this is in the passage of the text. He says, the text says, on the first day of the 7th month, he gathered his disciples together and said, next month, I want to leave this world. Now, we send out announcements, we're having a baby, we're having a shower, we're having a marriage. Next month, I'm going to leave the world. You're getting that in the mail. And he says, if you have any doubts, you'll have to ask me about them soon so that I can resolve them for you and in your confusion. After I go, there's not going to be anyone to teach you. So it's like he's not panicking. He's not saying, I know I'm going to go, and I'm freaking out. He says, no, look, I'm going. But you guys have any questions before I go? Because after I'm gone, there's nobody. And hearing this, it says, Fa Hai and the others wept. Except little Shen Hui alone remained emotionally composed and did not cry. He's the youngest of the disciples. He was a sort of child prodigy that came in. And the master then said, oh, little Shen Hui, only you've gained the equanimity to remain unmoved. Facing good and bad states, blame and praise, sorrow and joy, you're not stirred, you're not moved. None of the rest of you have attained to this. What have you been cultivating all these years with me on the mountain? No, he's scolding him. He's about to die. He praises Shen Hui, and he says, you guys are just, if you're crying, you don't get it. Remember the last time I read you the passage from Zhuangzi where he's beating the drum and his wife's lying dead in the other room? It's sort of like that. And someone comes in and says, why aren't you crying and weeping? He says, it'd show I didn't understand anything if I did that. And then the Huineng Lung says, and so who are you crying so sadly for now? Are you worried that I don't know where I'm going? I myself know where I'm going. If I didn't know where I was going, I wouldn't have been able to tell you ahead of time. No doubt you're crying because you don't know where I'm going, or you don't know where you're going. But if you knew where I was going, you wouldn't be crying. This is really beautiful. And he says, the Dharma nature fundamentally has no birth and no death, no coming or going. So he hits him with that. And then it says, here's the finishing. On the 8th day of the 7th month, the master suddenly said to the disciples, I want to go back to this province. Get a boat ready quickly. The whole community cried out and begged him to stay, but the master said, all Buddhas appear in the world and even appear to pass away. Whatever comes must go. This is eternally true. This physical body of mine must return somewhere. The assembled group said, Master, you're leaving, but sooner or later you're going to come back, right? And the master said, falling leaves return to the root. Who can say when they will return? And then he died. So I share this with you because it's pretty far out, but it also shows a kind of playful, joyous, he calls it the playful samadhi, the playful concentration when you're in this, but it treats birth and death not as something extraordinary or far out, but rather ordinary in the sense that with some mastery over this mechanism, in fact, not only does he know where he's going, but he can actually predict when it's going to happen, and also can tell it's not something sad. He doesn't say he's not coming back, and he doesn't say he does come back. Why does he not say that? Because clearly it's not the end, right? So why does he say that? When they ask him, you're going, but surely you'll come back, he says, who knows? Anybody? Don't think of it as theoretically, think about it as sort of psychological.
His answer wouldn't help them at all?
Something like that. There's a passage in the Nirvana Sutra where the disciples are trying to figure out what the Buddha said and meant and whatnot. And the Buddha said, I didn't say a single word. What? And they're trying to write it down. He says, I didn't say a single word. He says, life and death are the great matter. Get to work. Bye. And what he was doing there, if he said, I'm coming back, you go, oh, okay, well, we'll just hang out here and watch the door till he comes back. We'll stock the kitchen and be ready. We'll wait around. And what he was saying to them, no, birth and death is a great matter. Get to work on it now, because you don't know if I'm coming back. If you think I'm coming back, he would scold him again. What have you been doing all this time? You think I can save you? Can I eat for you? Can I wear clothes for you? Can I sleep for you? No. This is the teaching. So it's really profound. He doesn't say that he's not coming back, and he doesn't say he is. But he says to them, you don't know. And since you don't know, you better get to work. Anyway, at the end of the day here at the monastery, they say, this day is over. Our lives are that much less, like fish in an evaporating pond. What joys are in this? And then it says, cultivate single-mindedly as if saving your head, and so forth. It's this idea of a kind of urgency, but not freak-out urgency, a kind of seriousness of, like, what am I doing? What am I really doing day to day here that really is getting closer and closer to this kind of understanding? Anyhow, that's the end of those verses. I finished. Well, we sort of finished the verses, but we haven't finished the meaning. That could go on. But any questions or whatnot? You've been very patient. I know I went over time tonight. But I wanted to finish this part with you. Questions, comments? Anybody? I know it's a lot to digest or even to swallow. Yes? You'll have to go loud. My ears are... I'm in that phase now where it's starting to fade.
Hi, Marty. I guess my question is, we continue the karma thought after thought. Is there any expedient way that could help us kind of stop that process?
There's a way. It's interesting, the Chinese word is when the Bodhisattva vows, living beings are boundless, I vow to liberate them all. The afflictions are endless. The thought after thought, afflictions, habituations are endless. And then it says, I vow to cut them all off. And my teacher was very clear. He says, you don't cut them off. You don't suppress them. The word is duan. But duan can mean cut off, but it also means to interrupt the flow. Like if you change the flow of a stream, you don't actually cut it off, you change the flow. So duan has the idea of you can't suppress them. And in fact, when you start to meditate, they seem to be more, because now you're observing them more closely. Most of the time, we're distracted by distraction for distraction. And so we're just sort of like not even looking at ourselves. But when you sit quietly, then you can really see them. And that's actually progress. So that's where people freak, oh my God, it's worse when I'm meditating, I better stop. I gotta watch TV, it'll be better. Yeah, but then you come to die and TV's not gonna save you. No matter what Netflix series you're watching. Oh, I don't get the next series. Well, you're, anyhow. What you do then, the technique says, when you see them arising, very important, don't try to repress them and block them. This is absolutely essential. Nor indulge them and kind of get into them. Simply do the third possibility, quietly observe them and watch their rise and fall. So the process has to do, first of all, just to be aware of what's happening. And the second is very tricky. You do it with meditation, you practice, but then when you leave the meditation cushion, you go home to visit, you're in a relationship, you're in some kind of situation, you observe. You don't repress and you don't indulge, but you have a moment there where you just watch, almost like you distance yourself a moment, you shift the gears into neutral. And in that moment of not engaging and not repressing, not indulging it, that observation actually shows it to be something that is not real and powerful as you imagine. And then you're not feeding it anymore. And temporarily, you've interrupted that flow. And you've kind of taken the power away from it, because mostly it seems very, very powerful, these thoughts and these patterns, almost like it's impossible to deal with them. But this is where the principle of emptiness comes in, really important. They don't have any nature of their own. Remember, he was saying in this passage I just read, we construct them, we think they're real, we set them up. All our little boogeymen and whatnot, our fantasies are all there, and they seem very, very real. Stop feeding them, and they evaporate. And so it's like the feeding can be indulging them, but the feeding can also be trying to repress them. And so what you do is, this is the meditation of stopping and contemplating, stopping and contemplating. Just stop and observe, and they will rise and fall on their own. And once that happens, you get a kind of power. You say, whoa, this is interesting. If I don't do either of these, they don't really have this purchase over me. They're not as powerful as I thought. And that begins the process of then getting a liberation from these thought after thought patterns. It's really quite remarkable when it happens, because mostly we think these things are so powerful. I remember going to my teacher, and I said something like, "Oh, I'm having so much trouble, Sherpa, meditating. It's really, really hard. It's everything's just holding me back. It's just holding me back. All my afflictions are holding me back." And he said, "Nothing's holding you back. It's what you're holding on to." And he turned it completely around. He said, there can't be anything holding you back because all phenomena are empty. The holding back is you holding on. Let go, release your hold. And so it's almost like it's an awakening experience almost when you feel that for the first time. I'm doing this to myself. Nobody else is doing this to myself. Wow. That's the beginning of a kind of awakening. Good question. Some of these are pretty easy to deal with. And then there's ones that are really deeply rooted. And those are a little harder to weed out, and that's where patience is required. But if you trust the method eventually will deliver, even though some of these are harder. And they may come back. And if they come back, you just say, "Oh, you're back again. I recognize you. We met before." And then you just deal it again and say, "You're actually very empty. I'm sorry I fed you. I shouldn't be feeding you. It's a bad habit I have." And, empty it out again, and then they go away. And essentially, there's a letting go, untying of the knot. Yeah. I guess that's it. No more.
Marty, someone's asking the difference between the intermediate skandha body versus the skandha body, the demon skandha.
The what?
Demon skandha from the 50 demon skandhas. Is there a difference?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
So is there a difference between the two skandha states, like from the Sharangama's 50 demon skandha versus the intermediate skandha body?
That question would be a lot more specific to do with. I was using a term. They don't really have a term for what goes from life to life. It's just so gossamer and thin in the sense of something you can concretely get a hand. It's consciousness, it's awareness. It's not an entity, it's not a faculty. So they temporarily, he uses knowing awareness. The text uses intermediate between skandha bodies, but it's not a thing unto itself. It's not a self, it's not a soul. Be very careful about this. It's just a carrying, a platform that carries something from one to the other. It doesn't have any selfness to it. That's the best I can do in that question. Otherwise, I don't know what he's asking or she's asking. Okay. Wow, been a long night. Okay, we will do the transference. I suppose there's no announcements. There was a wonderful celebration at Redwood Vihara last weekend, I heard. A couple hundred people came to the Redwoods. Okay, I missed that. Anything coming up to announce, Ken? Amitabha session in the winter, starting when? January 20?
No,
December
December.
20th.
14th.
14th.
Yes.
Okay. All right, let's do the transference. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the triple jewel.